This is Becoming Inclusive from the Kaleidoscope Group, where we're thinking differently about diversity, equity, and inclusion for more empowered people at work. We're committed to real change, and that begins with real conversations. Welcome in.
Hey, I'm Reggie Ponder, and welcome to another episode of Becoming Inclusive. I have my co-host here with me, Catherine Potts. Hey, Kat, how are you?
Hey, I'm good. How are you?
I'm doing good. This time, which we do occasionally, we don't have a guest on, not because we couldn't find a guest, but there's just stuff that you and I just want to talk about. And in fact, what's so funny is that we already talked about it. That's when we decide to have one of these things. We like, you know what? Maybe we should do that on the podcast after we done had an hour of debate on it for 2 days or whatever. Anyway, I saw this article, Kat, that talked about how companies are beginning to monitor your screen time, your stroke time, to try to figure out what your productivity is. And so if you step away from the computer, then and you're away from it for a certain amount of time, that means that's time that you cannot say that you worked. And they're monitoring that because there are people who have taken on 2 or 3 at-home jobs, and they're not doing any of that at-home job. So they're trying to figure out how do we balance the fact that there's some people working really, really hard with the fact that there's some people that are probably just trying to skimp by. And I found the article interesting from the point of almost to the micromanaging, is that you're looking at every little thing that I do at every point in time. And you and I have talked about this. But before we get into the micromanaging part, I actually understand part of the reasoning for trying to do some kind of monitoring. If the work's not getting done, if people are saying they work 8 hours a day, but they're only working 3, I understand it. But at the end of the day, my thought is, did they meet their obligations is my thought. And so this whole thing about micromanaging was really interesting. And you and I talked about this. So have at it. You're just chopping at the bit. Go ahead.
I think there's 2 facets of this, right? There's yes, they are wanting to oversee or find out what is your productivity, but I think there's also a sector of trying to manage your productivity. And I ironically actually stumbled upon this quote that I think, is relevant to what we're talking about. So I'm going to share it for everybody. Micromanagement is a complete waste of everybody's time. It sucks the life out of employees, fosters anxiety, and creates a high stress work environment. Select the right people and give them room to get on with the job. So I saw that quote and it's relevant to this conversation, obviously. And I think that's kind of the core of it, right? Are you really just trying to see how productive somebody is, or are you micromanaging them? And then is micromanaging hurting or helping? Because for me, I know some people that, they're in a hybrid, or now they're full-time working from home, and, they have to make sure if they want to go and do something really quick in their house, they have to move their mouse or something like that to make sure that it looks like they're doing something, which I can't imagine that's making them more productive.
Yeah, I agree with you. Is that it is probably not making them more productive, and I think that the quote that you give says that let people go off and do what they need to do, and at some point, I guess you have to create a rapport with people that when you hire them, that you say, you know what, I have some kind of confidence that you can do the job. However, Kat, I actually understand and you've been a manager as well, having been a manager, I actually understand when you have no visibility and understanding of what your people are doing. So trying to find this balance of what are my people doing? I remember, this might not be a great analogy, but Mitch does these fantastic analogies. So I'm going to try to channel my inner Mitch. But in math, I could always come up with the answer, but I would very frequently not do it in the process, in the way in which they wanted you to do it. They say, show your work. I was like, I just know the answer. I know that 2 + 2 is 4. Well, do I have to show and carry the 2? And I just know that. And I think that as a manager, I don't know that you know that yet. I have to have something there to say, what are you doing? Let me see your work. Yeah, you sent it in, but what was your thinking? How did you come about that? Do you think that that's wrong, or is that the micromanaging that bothers you?
I don't think that it's wrong. I think sometimes it's helpful as a leader if you can see how someone got to something, because perhaps that way is more efficient than how you did, or better. I think it's about the approach. It's different if you're just having someone show you that to point out, to already have the answer being like, no, I want you to do it this way. But I mean, if we're talking about DEI and we're tying that in, you have to be open to how somebody else works and what makes them most productive and makes them most efficient, right? Like for me, I don't flourish being micromanaged. I just don't. And so when someone does that, it actually does give me more anxiety, right? And makes me probably less productive. But if I got my job done, right, the output, because you mentioned like how can people gauge, maybe they want to gauge, how can they gauge how productive somebody is if they're not doing something like that? Well, their output. Are they completing projects on time? Are they showing up to meetings on time? Are they evolving? Are they developing? Those sorts of things. Because when you start a job, you have X responsibilities. You can tell if somebody is not doing those things, and maybe some managers or supervisors perhaps would maybe say, and this is something Reggie, you might say, is I don't have the time to track what people's output is all the time, if they're actually hitting their goals. But to me, that seems a little bit more simple and more inclusive and open to diversity of how people work, than trying to basically keep tabs on people. And then and to me, that can also end up with people making a lot of mistakes because they're just trying to show that they're doing something in that moment, right? Like, let me move my mouse around. Let me just do this. Let me just do that to make sure that the timer doesn't go off. So what happens when you're so focused on making sure that the computer knows I'm doing something versus actually doing something?
I think that's interesting. I want to say you and I are both sports people. I play basketball, but you were really a sports person, being very, very good in soccer. And I want to bring this up, is that as a coach, I do need to see that you are practicing this particular skill. I need to see it. I don't need to have you tell me you did it. That's why we have practice. I have practice so I can see that you're absolutely using the technique that I'm talking about. And you can call that micromanaging or not, but I absolutely need to see it in action. How come I can't see that in action as a manager in work? I want to see it in action.
Well, I would hope too that there's quarterly or yearly reviews or check-ins with your team, because that's another thing too. And we've talked about this on past podcasts, especially in a remote world, you have to put extra effort into still being aligned internally. So I would argue that there should be other things in place to make sure that everybody's connected and doing what they need to do anyway, just because you are remote. I mean, Reggie, I haven't seen you in person in years, literally years. And, what do we have to do? We have to check in, we have to align, and through that, right, being on the same team, I do know what you're doing. I do know that you're executing certain goals, and you know that I'm executing and what's going on with me. Because, I mean, if you're implying that without being able to, you have to micromanage to see what someone's output is, and are you just letting people kind of be out on their own islands anyway? That's probably not a good practice regardless. So I think there's other ways and other opportunities to put an infrastructure in that doesn't hinder or make anybody feel like they're being babysat, but that as a manager or a supervisor, you're able to also measure, is this person actually hitting their goals? Are they developing? Are they doing these things? Because that's important too. Like, you do want to know that when somebody, if you're trusting that, okay, now we're going to go fully remote or hybrid, this person is doing their stuff. But I think we have to kind of meet in the middle, because not everybody works the same. There's people that are super, super efficient, and there's some people that it takes them a little more time. That's not a bad thing, but why should someone that's super efficient, can play Tetris with their day, have to be micromanaged because you might have a few people on your team that maybe do need to be micromanaged?
That's really, really interesting, because it makes me think of, I have a couple of friends who work for the U.S. Postal Service, and they can get their route done, I don't know, in half of the time that is allotted for them to get that route done, versus someone else who takes the full amount of time to get the route done. Now, I don't know if they have more packages or not, but a couple of my friends can absolutely whiz through their route. But they take it so much slower, because whizzing through their route, there's no benefit to just whizzing through that route. So they just kind of take their time, and they'll do what they do. And it's kind of come to the point that you're saying, is that some people are more efficient and so on and so forth. I also have a couple of folks who work for the union and are bricklayers, and you're only supposed to lay, I guess, so many bricks an hour, but there's other people who can put down twice as much. I don't know what the solution is for that. I think that this thing let me ask you this. What does micromanaging really look like to you? In the case of the Postal Service worker, does micromanaging look like a supervisor following that person around, making sure that person rings the bell, does the types of things? Is that micromanaging to you? What does it really look like to you, so we can actually define what we're talking about here?
Yeah, I think it varies, but for this example, I think it would be if like a manager was calling, right? Perhaps like every hour, every few hours, to ask, what are you doing? Where are you at? How many packages have you dropped off? Like doing hourly check-ins, that sort of thing. So, or not hourly, but, every 3 or 4 hours checking in, having the report, that kind of thing. Or even if there was a system, right, where you had to log in and every so often you had to put in there how many packages you dropped off, where you were, that kind of thing, like logging time, for example. Like that to me would be like micromanaging. And then I think the other part of it would be then if there's a role of the person's managing you, like what do they do with that information now, right? Like, I'm going to give you this plan. This is how you have to do it. This is how much time you have. And then giving you this like infrastructure that they think is appropriate based on, how short or long they think it should take, or the company thinks that it should take. That's kind of how I see it. Just because in your example, it's, there's several people. It takes one person longer, one shorter, but in the day, did all the packages get delivered? That's to me what's important, not how did the packages get delivered.
So here's.
Do you agree with that? What do you think?
Well, here's the dilemma of the postal supervisor. Is that everybody has these cases in their city of people who did not deliver the mail and put the mail in some dumpster and have been doing it for some time. So the people who didn't get the mail didn't know that they weren't getting their mail, because they're like, I guess I didn't get mail today. So there's, I still need to know that you delivered the mail in some kind of way, but you would say that's micromanaging, because I want to know that you stopped by Reginald Ponder's house and dropped that mail.
I think, okay. So in this case, I would hope that in this case, I would hope though that there's other systems in place where you wouldn't have to micromanage to know if someone's doing their job, that as a manager, again, or a supervisor, you're looking at that every week or at the end of every day to see what got delivered and what didn't get delivered. I would hope that would be a type of responsibility that a manager or supervisor has. I think if in a case where that's not the situation, then I could see where, okay, if you don't have any kind of procedure, or cadence of how things happen to make sure that those things get executed, then yeah, I guess you do have to check in every so often and do that kind of thing if you don't have anything else. And yeah, that would be the only way to do it. Because yeah, you need to make sure the mail gets to the recipient, and that it doesn't get lost.
So you're the last kind of thing I was kind of throwing here. You're in charge of podcasts, and for you, micromanaging would be asking, did you find the guest? What the topic is? When is it going to happen? Is that micromanaging for you?
I would say yes for me. Yes. But like currently, how we do it, it's like, this is your goal. This is what your goal is for the year. You have to reach this, and maybe some questions but we meet ever so often, to talk about the status of it, how it's going, all those sorts of things, and to make sure that every week, okay, yeah, in this dashboard, one went out a week, right? Like you can see whether or not I'm being productive or not based on that. So it's easy for someone that is managing me or trying to see how productive I am based on my output. If I go 3 weeks without a podcast, obviously something is happening and would warrant a response. Versus somebody every week being like, who's going to be on the podcast this week? When is it going to launch? What's the topic going to be? X, all of that stuff, to me would be micromanaging versus the current procedure.
I think that's a really good illustration of what you think is micromanaging. And before we close out, can you read that?
But you're actually brought up a really good point, though, is the understanding of micromanaging can vary. And when we're looking through that at a DEI lens, right, as a leader, it can be difficult to figure out what does micromanagement look like to each of my employees? Because there are some things that I might say are micromanaging that you might really need, Reggie, that you find to be really helpful.
Right. And so that becomes absolutely, and that becomes difficult. In fact, in the example that I gave where it's a true example where companies are monitoring keystrokes and FaceTime on the computer, a couple of women said that they liked that. And the reason they did is because they felt that they were being kind of discounted in their contributions that they were making to the team. And they knew that some of their male counterparts weren't making the same types of contributions. So they were like, yes, bring it on, because you'll see that I'm working, that I'm at my desk, and actually it'll help me bubble to the top. I mean, I'll bubble up to the top, because right now you just think that Jim is doing what he's doing, and he's really not doing that.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, that's true. That's where I think it could be helpful. So in answering those questions, a lot of them too is like, what does Kat see as micromanaging? Okay. But then also there's opportunity there, because depending on your level in the company, you may not get that much exposure to different people. And that might be a way for you to actually get that exposure. And so I really think it's by person, right? Like it's by person, but then as a leader, okay, I can't customize how I manage every single person, because then you're having to manage, like, remember, Susie likes it this way, Reggie likes it this way, Jody likes it that way. Like that obviously is way too much for a leader to have to do. But I do think there's just how can we meet in the middle on this? Because and I think it's just kind of breaking it up into the different buckets, right? Productivity, efficiency, output. To your point, the example you just gave, Reggie, exposure. What are the needs? What am I seeing from my employees that are important? How can I look at this and elevate my employees without harming their productivity? But then also we can't make everybody happy. That's just a fact. But I think sometimes what people like about working from home is the flexibility in your day. So if you take that away, would people say I may as well just go into the office?
Yeah, and what's interesting about that is that I haven't seen all the studies, but I've seen some studies that suggest that working from home, people work more than they would than
Yeah,
being in an office because you're not taking your work home. Your work is already at home. And
right.
so if you take the middle of the day to go to a dental appointment, you come back, you do the things you need to do, but at 10 o'clock at night, you're back at it because your office is right in your home and you're like, okay, I have to get these things done. I don't know if that's 100% true, but I have seen some studies that suggest
Yeah.
that people work more when they're at home. I think what I take from our discussion as we close out here, Kat, is that micromanaging is different for different people, and that what managers already do is they look at their individuals anyway. If for instance, you have a child at home, and if your child right now came onto the screen, your manager would be, oh, I understand that because you're at home. That's just that discretion, that flexibility of saying, no worries, go ahead and take care of Oliver for the 2 minutes, and whatever you need to do, we'll start back up. But I think the pandemic has exposed that in some ways to say that there needs to be a little bit more flexibility. When we've always, as managers, had some type of discretion as to how we interact with our counterparts and our employees, our workers, or whatever you'd like to call it. So I would say that that it does look different for each person. However, this whole issue of discretion and flexibility as a manager is not a new issue. We've always had it. We've always done it. It might be a little bit more pronounced now because we're at home, and just try to figure that out for what your players need. I'll end it with saying, again, as a sports person, you cannot treat all of you are on a high level soccer team. You cannot treat everybody exactly the same. You got your scorers, you got your defenders, you got your whatever. I don't even understand soccer.
Midfielders, forwards.
Midfielders and all that, and you give them different tasks, and you also look at where they are from an ability perspective as well. You're like, okay, they're not going to be able to bend it like Beckham or bend it like Kat, and they're just not going to. They don't do that. So there's some variability in terms of, I think, how you work with your employees, work with your team, all that type of stuff. And I just think managers need to keep that in mind. Last comments for you?
No, definitely. I mean, I like that analogy about soccer. I mean, there would be different drills for different positions on the field. And sometimes if you were a forward, you would have to partake in, a skill or something, or drill that was for defenders. Like, you know what I mean? So that's what you're pointing out is true. It's just DEI, right? It's diversity, equity, and inclusion. And you just have to be aware that different people have different needs, and there is a less overwhelming way to cater to them without trying to make everybody happy, but also nourishing each individual's best way of being productive.
So I'll ask you to end it with the quote. Read the quote once again.
Oh, yes. I'm going to read it one more time. Micromanagement is a complete waste of everybody's time. It sucks the life out of employees, fosters anxiety, and creates a high-stress work environment. Select the right people and give them room to get on with the job. And I also want to point out really quick before we end that this micromanaging can happen whether you are in person in an office, or you are out of an office and working from home, or if you're on. So it's not exclusive to just this work from home.
Well, I'd like to say thank you, Kat, for this conversation. I don't think we solved anything, everyone who's listening.
Yeah.
I just think that I just think we brought up an issue which we'd like to hear from you. You're out there as a manager, as a worker. We'd love to hear from you as to what you think about this particular topic, because it's so fascinating, and I think it is so variable. I'm Reggie Ponder, and this is Becoming Inclusive, and that is Catherine Potts, my co-host.
Bye, everyone. Oh, don't forget, like, share, let us know how you feel, all that sort of stuff. The feedback is appreciated.
Thanks for joining us, and a special thanks to our subscribers. Consider becoming one today. Becoming Inclusive is presented by the Kaleidoscope Group, your full-service diversity, equity, and inclusion partner serving clients worldwide. Learn more and continue the conversation at kgdiversity.com.